Okay, so again, your first sentence is your thesis. The rest of the first paragraph, leave that blank for now. Right? Leave a blank space there. Then there's the next bit. When I say bit, could be a paragraph, could be 2 paragraphs, could be, you asked about how many paragraphs, and it's like, well, how many do you need? So you can think of this as sections or chunks or bits. So the next bit, 1 or 2 or 3 or paragraphs, whatever you need, is argument for your thesis. Right. In the paper, that's the argument for your thesis. Now, what's actually going to go there, this should be easy, because you've just spent a week or 2 thinking about the issue, thinking about the topic, and you decided that this thesis was the right thesis. So you decided this on the basis of reasons. So you've got those reasons already in your head. All you have to do now is write them down in this 1 or 2 paragraphs here, right? You just write down the reasons you already came up with. You already know these reasons because you already did this thinking, right? Okay. So I'm going to call this the third bit. Then the third bit, after you've explained all the reasons for your thesis, however long you need, you know what, you want to be clear and complete and detailed. By the way, when you're explaining yourself, which is better? Writing something that needs a college education to understand, or writing something that only needs a middle school education to understand? If you could write so that middle school students, saying the same thing, saying exactly the same thing, but one version of it, a middle school student can understand everything you're saying, and the other version, the middle school student doesn't understand it, but someone with a college degree does. Right? Someone needs a college degree to understand your work. Which is better, the middle school paper or the college student paper? Really? You want to write more difficult than you need to be? The best paper is the one the middle school, I don't know how tall they are. I think that's like, tell me if do I need to go up or down? Middle school students? They're getting taller, yeah. All right, say middle school student. If a middle school student can understand what you've written for a college philosophy class, you are brilliant. You are a genius. You have written wonderfully. If someone needs to be a college graduate to figure out what you're saying, you're a terrible writer. Seriously, a terrible writer. All right. A good writer is a writer who other people can understand. A writer who no one else can understand is either a terrible writer or a terrible thinker. You might be insane. So, if you get a piece of paper, a text or something, and you don't understand it, that means that the writer has failed to communicate to you. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with you. So you should try to write. Now, this might be the rule that only applies in my class. Other teachers might want you to write badly. I mean, according to their horrible standard. I mean, according to a different standard. Right. But for me, if you take what you're writing and you make it harder to write, that makes it harder to read. It makes it harder for me to read, and it makes it unpleasant. Whereas if you write clearly and simply so I get it right away, I'm happy. And don't you want your professor to be happy when he's deciding on your grade? Yeah, that's an A. I have no idea what she's saying. F. So you write so that a middle school student can understand you. Probably you can't if it's complicated philosophy stuff. But try to aim for that way. Try to be as clear as you possibly can. At least write so a high school student could understand you. Does it make sense to my style standards here? By the way, I don't particularly care about spelling or grammar or anything like that, as long as I can understand it. Right? Spelling mistakes won't cost you. Grammatical mistakes only cost you if I can't figure out what you're trying to say. Right? If you make my eyes cross like this, it's probably not good. Right? So, okay, back to the third bit. You've written your argument, your thesis, you've made it clear and detailed so that a kindergarten student can understand it. You've got pictures and crayons and stuff. Probably, but no pop-up books. Because there's no way I know of to submit a pop-up book to turn it in. At least not yet. That was funny in my head. Why didn't you laugh? I don't know. Weird. I know I'm weird. Okay, so the third bit is arguments. The S is in parentheses because there might just be one argument. One or more arguments against your thesis. So there are people who think you're right about this, people who agree with you on this topic, and there are people who disagree with you on this topic. And this is their forum. Try to represent as best you can reasons people might have to disagree with you. Now, you've already thought about these, and you didn't accept these reasons, and you got reasons why they're wrong. But you still have to represent them. You still have to put them in the paper. And ideally, what you want to do is to give the arguments against your thesis. Let's say it's just one argument. Let's say you're writing about, oh, I don't know, I've forgotten all my topics. You're writing about rationalism. Right, which none of you understand yet. I'll explain it later. But you're writing about rationalism, and you're for it. And someone else is against it. And you want to write the argument against rationalism here in a way that the person who's against it would say, yes, that's what I would say. Or I would be happy to say that. That looks good to me. That's my real argument. You want to represent them the way they want to be represented. The best way they would want to be represented. If I was writing a paper where I attacked intelligent design, here would be my argument against intelligent design. If my thesis is intelligent design is rubbish, I put my argument here. But when I come here to give the arguments against my thesis, which in this case would be the argument for intelligent design, and possibly arguments against my arguments, I would want to write this in a way that someone who is for intelligent design could look at that and say, you know, that's a good way of saying what I think. You want to give the other side fully and fairly. Does that make sense? Right, that's, you got that. Right. All right, and here's the last bit. I'm going to put that in red for variety. So, the last bit is the rebuttals to the third bit. Right. Now, if you've got one argument in the third bit and then you have one rebuttal here, you already thought about this argument and you decided it wasn't a good argument for a reason. And here's where you state that reason. So, I looked at the argument for intelligent design. I decided it wasn't a good argument, and so I have, for reasons, so I take my reasons and I explain them here. Right. Again, this whole thing is reporting on a thinking process. You are giving a description of the thinking process by which you came to this thesis. Ideally, all the thinking work is done. All you're doing now is typing. Of course, you know, when you're typing, you think of more stuff, and then you have to change it, and sometimes you go back to the drawing board, and you throw this out, and you get started again, and you can do back and forth. Writing is a messy process. Thinking is a messy process. So I'm just sort of showing you an ideal thing. All right? Okay, so you've written the argument for your thesis, you've written the arguments against your thesis, you've rebutted the arguments against your thesis as best you can, and you're kind of happy with this, right? Right, once you're kind of happy with these three bits, you go back to that blank space, and you write a summary of the other three bits what you just wrote. So you put in, you've written these three bits, there's a blank space here, or in a word processing there's a gap, and then you put into that blank space the summary of the other three bits you just wrote. So that when I read your paper, I know your thesis, and I have an idea about where you're going to go in your argument. So I know something about what you're going to say. Nothing here will be a surprise. I've got, all the details will be in here, very little details. It's a summary. You know how to do a summary, right? You boil something down to a little statement, so you boil it down here. And this really helps me understand your paper. And if you're writing papers for other classes, this helps your professor understand the rest of your paper. And if your professor understands your paper, the better your professor understands the paper, the better grade you get, generally, if your professor's any good. But as you know, every professor who isn't me does it wrong, so you're just not going to work. Actually, the key is, in your other classes, you go to your professor and you ask what do they want for papers, and they'll tell you something different. And you do whatever they want. So this is my way of doing the papers. Any questions? Does this seem clear and doable? Yes?
Is this how you want us to outline all our papers?
No, I don't want you to outline anything.
Well,
This is the ideal structure. Okay, it is the ideal structure. I don't like outlines. An outline is something you do on your own to organize your thinking. It's not something you should ever turn into, well, at least you'd never turn it into me. Unless you're in a class where you're being taught how to do outlines. I don't know if there's an outlining class. Right. So this is the ideal thing for your first paper. Try to do this. Maybe you won't be able to think of arguments against your thesis, but you might write a big long argument for your thesis. Maybe you don't come to a conclusion and you write a paper that says, well, first I thought this, and then I thought, well, that might be wrong because of this, so then I thought this other thing, but I thought that's wrong with this. If you write a paper, I call this rambling. If you write a paper and you say, look, start off thesis, I have no idea what to do in this topic. I've got a lot of ideas, but I don't know how to organize them or how to come to a bottom line. Here's what I thought. Here's the first thing I thought. And here's the second thing I thought. And I thought this. But then I thought this. And then I remember what my Aunt Sally told me, those many years ago in Madagascar. And she said, and you write that down. And I feel like this is relevant, but I can't tell you how it's relevant. But, I think, and then I thought this other thing. Then I went and had a cup of coffee, and when I came back, I decided everything I wrote so far is wrong, but you told me to turn it in anyway, right? And this is why I think it's wrong. And, you write down something. And, I've had people tell me that they wrote 5 pages, but then they cut 3 pages out because it was wrong. And I said, no, don't do that. Just change the way you frame it. Take those 3 pages and say, well, here's the first thing I thought. I thought this, I thought this, I thought this, I thought this. But then I decided this was all wrong. And so if you write 3 pages of wrong stuff, you've written 3 pages. Right? And then you can put at the end, go back to the beginning. Word processors are great because you can put any amount of stuff up front. You go back and say, look, I went 3 pages down a blind alley, but here's my reasoning, and here's why I think it's wrong. And I go, well, look, Yeah, that is reasoning, and that's something somebody could think, and it's a set of arguments. Good for thinking them up. Oh, yeah, they are wrong, and oh wow, you've got why they're wrong. You've given me a set of arguments, and you've told me why they're wrong. Well, that's what I want you to do here. Give me a set of arguments and tell me why these arguments are no good. Right? So bad arguments you think up are okay. You get some credit for the thinking them up. And if you think them up and then tell me why they're bad, that's extra, that's more, right? It all adds on. Was that helpful? Right, so you've got some flexibility here. Just don't write an introduction and don't write a conclusion. Don't do an overview at the bottom or try and extend it to the to the future or the lesson. Well, the moral of the story is, don't dance the mazurka in Madagascar. People will be confused. Whatever, don't do that. Just stuff that's to do with this thesis, supporting it, discussing arguments against it, discussing against it. And if you come to the end of the paper and then suddenly you change your mind, you go, okay, well I changed my mind, and you add that on there, and you go back to the front and say, well here's my paper, but at the end I changed my mind. Don't be surprised. I'll say, oh okay, well thanks for warning me, and I'll be happy. By the way, always indicate point of view. This you write in the first person, just write it. I think this, or just write it. When you get to this, you say, people who disagree with me might think, or an argument against me is. Don't just start writing as if you suddenly changed your mind in the middle of the paper. Right, indicate point of view. I get these schizophrenic papers that start, intelligent design is wrong because blah, blah, blah. Intelligent design is right because blah, blah. Wait a minute, you just said it was wrong. Don't contradict yourself. Right. Oh, that's the opposing view. Okay. Thank you.